Hi, it's Mary Rowe from the Canadian Urban Institute. You caught me there just taking a little swig of water before we got started. I'm from CUI, very pleased to be welcoming you to this session and to the four panelists who've come on to give their perspectives about what they're observing and what must urban Canada look like as we recover. What should our priorities be? This is 2 days after the federal budget was announced, and it's a very poignant moment, I would say, in Canada. We have neighborhoods across the country that are continuing to be extraordinarily challenged. We have healthcare systems, at least in 2, if not 3 provinces, that are being pushed to the very edge. And we always start these sessions with a recognition that we have people across the country, essential workers, devoted to trying to keep Canadians safe and keep them healthy as best we can. And so we always want to acknowledge that. And I am, I'm sure with many, horrified that we're back into the situation that we're in on the 21st of April, into the thick of a third wave. And who knows if there's a fourth wave, who knows? So a time of extraordinary uncertainty. CUI is a national organization committed to creating the kind of connective tissue to allow us to learn from each other and adapt quickly and build our own capacity to be responsive to challenges. Not that we ever thought this would be the challenge or multiple challenges that we're facing. I'm happen to be in Toronto today, which is the traditional territory of a number of First Nations ancestral lands, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Wendat peoples, and the Haudenosaunee, and also many for other First Nations and Inuit and Métis peoples. And we have 2 treaties that we're covered by here, and my co-panelists are in different environments. We have the Williams Treaty and Treaty 13. At CUI, we have over this year, with all of you that have been joining these City Talk sessions, been struggling to come to terms with the legacy of exclusion that urban practices have reinforced, and the extent to which that's racialized, the extent to which that is disproportionately experienced by people of color and Indigenous people and newcomers. And it's just something that is starkly in front of our eyes every day when we open the news or listen to the news, and we see where the impacts of COVID most acutely felt, where the impacts of lockdowns most acutely felt, and all the structural kinds of changes that we have to kind of come to terms with and figure out how are we going to remedy these things as we move forward into a different kind of urban life, she says, hopefully. So that's part of the conversation that I'm keen to have with my colleagues here, about what are you seeing. We started these sessions by asking people to talk about what's working, what's not, and what's next, and anticipating that we'd be at this for a number of months, not realizing that we might be at this for a number of years. And in terms of having a conversation that's so viscerally upon us. The other thing is that we also had a snowstorm this morning here in Ontario. So there are just a number of conditions that remind us that we live in a physical environment called a city. And these 4 have a particular perspective about the intersection of place and people, and that we call city, Canada being one of the most urbanized countries in the world. So I'm encouraging everybody to participate in the chat. It's always great for you to tell us where you're watching from, put some questions up there. Feel free to answer each other's questions as you often do. We post these sessions, as people know, we post them online afterwards. We post the chat, so whatever you put in the chat, just be conscious of that. It's going to get posted. And I know that the participants here are really keen to hear what you have to say, and then they're going to have some chance to interact with each other. So the question we were putting is, what must urban recovery look like? And we're appreciative to have all different parts of the country here and different perspectives. In the Globe and Mail, we have both Francis and Douglas coming from the Globe, and we appreciate the Globe's interest in these topics and in their ongoing engagement with us on the dynamics in cities as we see them, and how should that affect our strategy nationally as we recover. So we have Francis and Amarjeet and Colin and Doug, and bringing different perspectives. I've encouraged them to be frank and open, and they all wear different hats at different times. And so they're just here as people to give us their perspective and to help us elevate a conversation so that we can try to make sense of what we see. So Francis, I'm going to go to you first, if I may. We'll go west to east, kind of, sort of, and we'll start with you. If you could just give us a perspective. Where are you, first of all, physically? Tell people where you are, and then what are your kind of key observations as you look out your front door and as you continue to work your beat for the various ways that you write about these things. So to Francis Bula, welcome to City Talk. You're muted, Francis. I just have to unmute you, or you need to unmute yourself there.
I did not mute myself. Someone else did it.
Yes, I know. Well, now you're unmuted, so good.
Anyway, well, I was hoping you'd go with Doug first because he's always got the brilliant takes on everything. But so just to be a big downer, I'm here in my attic in Vancouver where it's projected to be 20 degrees today or more. And I'm looking out the window and it's blue sky and I see gorgeous pink cherry blossoms in the next street. So sorry, everyone, for that. But getting back to cities, and I live in the center of one. I'm in a sort of a ring of older neighborhoods just outside the downtown core. So obviously, what I hear from the people I deal with all the time, because I cover city politics here, urban issues, is the things that they're looking to the federal government for are help with housing, help with transit, help with kind of keeping the city economy going. And an interesting thing that I'm seeing here in BC is that cities see the federal government as being much more helpful on this front than the BC NDP government, because they see that the Liberals want to shore up their urban voters, particularly the female voters, who are going to love things like increased spending on childcare, which helps keep the economy going, and the issues that they focus on. So whereas the NDP sort of takes that urban vote for granted and has been putting a lot more effort into supporting sort of some of the other areas that they think might swing towards the NDP, interior cities, the north, and so on. So I see people who are involved in city politics here feeling more hopeful about what the federal government is doing. For sure, it's never enough, and you're never sure exactly what the Liberals are going to come through with in what year. Like, will it be 10 years from now, this promise that they're making? But certainly one of the things that they've appreciated the most is the Rapid Housing Initiative, because for the first time, the federal government delivered money directly to cities for that. That's a first. Usually any money that comes from the federal government gets funneled through the province, and the province kind of decides what's going to happen with that. And that's what happened with I should have looked the name up before, but the relief funds that they distributed at some point in the pandemic.
The Safe Restart program. Yeah. It went through the provinces. That's true.
It went to the provinces, and it was allocated in very different ways in different provinces. So the big concern in BC was that the larger cities got much less proportionally than some of the smaller ones. And whereas Ontario was a bit more, it was more on a per capita basis, not strictly, but more so. And, when I compared cities of the same size in BC and Ontario and what they got, in Ontario, they got, it was more proportional to their population than it was in BC. So the city people that I talked to were really upset about that. In the larger cities, the smaller cities loved it because they got, a lot of money, enough to cover, half their budget sometimes for the year. So they really appreciated the Rapid Housing Initiative, and there's been an increase in this budget. Another 1.5 billion, not the 7 billion that the Federation wanted, but another 1.5. So anyway, that's one of my points I was going to make. There's lots of other points to make, and I'll just stop talking here and listen with interest to what others have to say.
A couple of interesting things, Frances, that you raised there, and I think it's going to sort of frame our conversation. I'm going to come to Amarjeet next, who knows this jurisdictional question very well. But a couple of things. One is this point you made about childcare. And, we do now have the lowest participation of women in the workforce, I think, since before the Second World War. So it is an extraordinary moment, and all sorts of productivity folks are asking this. Are women going to return at the numbers that they need to, aside from women having their own aspirations to participate in the workforce? Just we need workers. Canada needs people working. And so that's one piece. The second piece that you raised, which is interesting, is the political piece here about Liberals courting urban votes. And again, Amarjeet knows this world because it's his, has been his in the past. And as you suggest, wondering, gee, do the NDP at the provincial level take it for granted where the Liberals are going to be more engaged? The third thing, though, this point about, are we entering a new era where the federal government is going to look for ways to get money directly into municipal hands? And there are people, this is a very big topic, obviously, but there are people querying now whether federalism is actually been working through the pandemic. Lots of ways to look at that, but the Rapid Housing Initiative is one, the Canada Healthy Communities Initiative is another, where there are monies being channeled directly to municipal governments and to agents, not-for-profit housing developers, for instance, working in local communities. And is this a new model? Forgetting the politics for a second, is it a new model to get resources into the hands of the jurisdiction and the institutional infrastructure at the local level, rather than it having to be siphoned to the province? I'm sure that's going to be comments I'll get from my fellow panelists about that. So over to you, Amarjeet. We're going to go from sunny, magnolia blooming Vancouver to Chinook on the way, maybe at any time, Edmonton, to get your perspective, and also because you have been a local politician and a federal politician. So I'm interested to hear your reflections. The federal budget, you can obviously riff off what Francis has said, but also your own perspective as you look out your door.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to be part of this, Mary. It's a beautiful day here in Edmonton. So I know I am all for, feeling empathy and everything else, right? But if you got snow in Toronto, I don't think much about it, right? Because we get it all the time. Right? So
I know you're not very sympathetic. I know.
No, I'm not very not on that part, right? I want to actually build on what Francis where she left off. I think the federal government, and I speak from my experience, has been very intentional in building stronger relationship with municipalities, because a lot of the work that federal government wants to do actually aligns with where municipalities are going. And I remember when I was the federal infrastructure minister, first time in Canadian history, we invited FCM, we invited big city mayors to be part of discussions when we were meeting with provinces and territorial leaders. So there was some resistance from some provinces, why are you inviting municipalities directly to a federal conversation when they are the creators of the provinces, right? So what we tried, we were able to convince provinces to have a seat for cities on the table. I think municipalities are aligned with federal government on climate change. They're aligned with federal government on providing a more affordable housing, deal with homelessness, and as well as on the some of the initiatives that are highlighted in this budget. So I think it's natural. I don't think it's intentional from a political outcome point of view. It's more intentional in a where we want to be on building stronger Canada and stronger communities, right? So it is interesting to hear from Francis, because here in Alberta, a lot of people feel that Ottawa is dealing with cities because we have a conservative government, right? So it's interesting to hear from Francis that same thing is happening in British Columbia, where there's an NDP government who has been very friendly with federal Liberals, and John Horgan NDP work well on number of issues. So I think I really wanted to observe that. I think we also need to be cognizant of the fact that the recovery cannot be cookie cutter. Each city and each region are facing different challenges. There are challenges related to COVID, absolutely. The hollowing off our downtowns, for example, right? And small businesses that are struggling, and how economic recovery looks like. But there are also structural changes that are happening in our economy that started happening before COVID. When I look at my province, we are going through a big energy transition. Like, we are hurt because of the downturn in the oil and gas sector. So I think recovery needs to be nimble enough that we're keeping in mind the structural changes that were happening before COVID, and also what COVID has laid bare, some of the issues from homelessness to poverty to mental health and deep-rooted racism that has existed in our communities for decades and centuries is now glaring in our faces, right? So how we do that, I think, is going to be a collective effort.
I should have acknowledged in the introduction too that we're at a particularly poignant moment in race relations, and it's not just the United States that the Chauvin verdict is resonating. It's seen, I think, and as we know, it's one of the only things that took COVID off the front pages in the last couple of days. Are we going to see a significant kind of reshifting and a recognition and an acknowledgement of systemic racism and how that's been penetrating various institutions, including policing? And Canada is not exempt from this. So I think that this context of equity and fairness, and are we restructuring? Can we restructure? Amarjeet, I just want to take exception with one thing, and then we'll come next. Colin, I'll come to you next, and then Doug. Do we really, are cities just basically then at the whims of the disposition of a particular government, federal government or provincial government? Doesn't that just kind of bug you? I know you've worked at both levels, but really, do we really have to say, I watch the machinations that municipal governments have to go through, and they have to be able to make this case to this federal government, for instance, the current one, that your climate goals will only be met by what we are able to do locally. So they have to do all these things to curry favor. Aren't we to a place in this country where we need more autonomy and not have to be constantly navigating, this is their agenda, this is their political angle? Doesn't that drive you a little crazy?
I hear your frustration, and I share your frustration, and I share the frustration of many leaders throughout this country where municipalities are not treated as equal and a very important order of government where people's lives are touched every day, from transit to housing to recreational infrastructure to policing to fire to some picking up garbage and all that, parks and everything. Quality of life is touched by everything that municipalities do, but the resources are so limited and so dependent on other orders of government. So that's the reality. And that was one of the reasons actually I ran for federal office after serving on city council for 8 years to make a difference. I think we did. Look at the transit funding, for example. When we designed the infrastructure plan in 2016, we made sure that money is actually going directly to municipalities based on transit ridership allocation, even though it has to flow through the provinces, but provinces have no control how cities use that money. I think gas tax funding is another good example. Rapid housing initiative is another good example. So we are working within the limitations of the constitutional constraints, but I think you're right. We need to find a ways to increase those collaborations in a way that I don't think we will change the constitution over the next while, but as we deal with the realities, I think more we can work together, better we will be. And I have seen that. I have seen that collaboration.
Yes, in your previous role, I get it. We had a whole thing a couple of weeks ago with the Massey College Summit on Cities, and it was several days of this, and people being really to a place of saying they're not willing to see the constitutional word continually put up as a barrier, and that basically we just have to get on with meeting the needs of people. And I have asked as bluntly as I can ever ask anybody that has come in a political role to say, if municipal governments had more power and more money and more autonomy, would fewer people be dying, fewer people being impacted by COVID? I know that it's a hard question for people to be ready to answer, but I just think in a moment of crisis that we are seized by, this muddied jurisdictional thing just becomes almost impossible to navigate. And I just want us to, I don't know how we get over ourselves and just start to figure out what are the solutions. Colin, I'm going to pass to you. What do you think the solutions can be? And what's your perspective from all the various hats that you wear?
Well, thank you. First off, very good to be here. Second off, I am with Mary in enjoying the snow, which is evaporating. And right in the middle of downtown Toronto, high up in the building, in the condo building looking out. So I am looking, I looked at a picture of snow this morning, but fortunately it looks to be getting just a touch warmer. I'm going to pick up on a few points from Amarjeet and Francis, but I would just say my solid answer to the question on whether municipalities should be given more power is a solid yes. Certainly in one of my former roles as vice chair of Toronto Community Housing Corp, for most of my time on that board, we dealt with effectively what was a critical funding gap that was well known at the City of Toronto, but couldn't be solved by the City of Toronto. And as a result, people lived in deplorable conditions. We would tour some communities and they'd be able to go to the side of a house and tear off the brick. Like, this is in the City of Toronto. What do we see? We saw in my last couple of weeks on that board, an intervention from the federal government to give 1.3 billion to Toronto Community Housing. That's wonderful. But what we do see is various interventions over and over and over again. And at what point do we say, like, great on one-off interventions, but we have to look at the system and how it's operating.
And doesn't it drive you crazy that you had to use the language that the federal government gave you, $1.3 billion? Like, that part, doesn't it must have, as a governor of the corporation, it must have just infuriated you, right?
Well, I had a fantastic time on that corporation, but so many things infuriated me.
I'm sure.
That's one. You are, and I think we've made this point, you're charged with the responsibility, the obligation, and you want to do a good job to deliver, but you can't. You don't have the tools in the toolbox to deliver. At least that was the situation that I found myself in. If I then connect 2 points, the COVID point and the racism point, they've been intertwined.
Yeah.
Right. So we have seen through COVID the impact of racism on our society here in Canada and on urban communities. And we've seen the different impacts in the GTA, whether you're talking about Brampton or Mississauga or Toronto or Pickering or Markham, all have been affected very differently. Right. And that has to do with where do racialized individuals find themselves on the social economic ladder of this country. And the COVID impacts, the folks that are in ICUs, the folks that can't get access to vaccines because we didn't put them in the pharmacies in their communities.
I know.
Right? All of that and the decision-making behind that. And now we've seen in the last week, municipalities basically breaking away from the provincial flow and basically doing their own things. That goes back to the point that we're talking about municipalities and the province. The only other thing I would just say is, from a Black person in this country perspective, I have subscribed to the notion of this country being welcoming to all and being an example for the world, and I think we are. But what this year has shown in particular, and over the last 3, 4, 5 years with more data, is that in so many different respects, this country is not that different than the USA, right? So whether it's policing, whether it's unemployment being substantially higher for Black individuals, whether it's, we also have a different lifespan in this country depending on your income quintile. And when you have the majority of Black individuals in those bottom quintiles, you have them living shorter lives, right? We've got all these issues going on in this country. But fortunately, over the last year and a half, we've had a conversation, and a lot of those individuals live in cities, right? So this is very much an urban issue. And I'll say the last thing one more time, which is at the end of the day, I fundamentally believe one layer of government can't solve it all. And I think it's been mentioned before, you have to partner with community organizations, with businesses. You have to have a whole of society approach to deal with these issues. And I'm just using racism as an example, but that goes for so many other things as well.
We have a frame, we use place-based policymaking, everything has to start at the local level, place-based. If we had taken vaccination distribution from a place-based perspective, it would have been rolled out quite differently. If we had taken interventions in neighborhoods specific to the neighborhood where the COVID where it was manifesting, and had specific interventions that might have stemmed it. It's just this notion that we have to disaggregate all the time and see if we can figure out what the local solutions are. I mean, I think the innovation community understands this because they can see that incubation of ideas happens at the most local level. If I could ask one of my colleagues from CUI to put up a link to the COVID signpost reports, which we did every 100 days, they really lay out what Colin has just described, that the incidence of COVID and the impact of those lockdowns disproportionately felt by racialized communities, equity-seeking communities, and it is spatially organized. Which is just the staggering thing. I'm with you, Colin. We have this thing about Canadian exceptionalism. Let's hope we've dropped that, because it doesn't appear to be the case. David, let me come to you now, Doug. And you have made a whole career of writing around newcomer communities, settlement communities, not just in Canada, but you've just been in Europe doing it there and looking at some of the models over there. So very interested in your perspective and how you respond to your colleagues here on the session. And then we'll come back to some general conversation after you give us your perspective. Thanks, Colin. Over to you, Doug.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you everybody for your expertise. Let me take a few paces back and try to do what Mary said and look out my window here in Toronto to try to characterize what the cities and housing problems are in Canada, and where there might be a mismatch between what the federal government is talking about in this budget and what is really needed. So outside my window is the Christie Pitts neighborhood of Toronto, which until the end of the 1990s was a low-income immigrant reception neighborhood, what I have called an arrival city. It was the initial place of low-cost housing destination for Central European Jews fleeing the pogroms, then for Northern Mediterranean families from Italy and Portugal looking for cheap houses, and then for people from East and South Asia on low incomes. And they were typically like the Portuguese family that owned this house before we did. They bought it for $25,000 in the 70s, used its rise in value to finance small business and education and that sort of thing. And that's sort of the Canadian model of integration, inclusion. It's the Canadian story. It's using housing as a platform and housing ownership as a platform for becoming a middle-class Canadian. And that's worked for about 120 years. And traditionally, about 70% of newcomers to Canada buy a house within 10 years of arriving. It's why we don't have the economic integration problems that some other countries do, or we haven't until recently. And this neighborhood also has low-income housing and social housing and refugee shelters and that sort of thing. But that's not where the action is. And when I look at what the federal government is talking about doing, most of its funding is for low-income housing, as far as I can tell, which is important. Nobody can besmirch that. What Colin said about social housing in Toronto is very true. But there's a housing supply shortage across Canada's cities, and I would argue it's the biggest problem in Canada, and certainly the biggest problem in Canada's cities. And while there are housing supply shortages on all ends of the market, including the lowest income housing, the lowest income housing is not where the most acute shortage is located. And you can show the most acute supply shortages are located the next step up the ladder, when people move from renting at the lowest income or being in social housing at the lowest income to a level of success where they would like to have their first house that they own, or that they have sustained better quality rental tenure on. In other words, when they want to move from just arriving to becoming settled Canadians through the process of housing. There is suddenly such a vacuum of housing in the largest cities in that particular spot that is leaving people stuck, and it's leaving people stuck in a racially segregated way, because newcomers to Canada and their children and grandchildren disproportionately tend to be from what we used to call from racialized backgrounds, visible minority backgrounds. And the housing crisis is one of several factors that's creating de facto segregation. And we explore, and this has become acute during the COVID-19 pandemic. Me and my colleagues at the Globe and Mail did a project last year where we mapped the specific neighborhoods in Canadian and US and European cities by rates of COVID, by population density, by income, by percentage of racialized populations. And the overlap between all those things was extraordinary. COVID-19 in 2020 at least was a disease of the apartment inner suburbs, like almost exclusively, whether you're in Houston or New York City or Toronto or Vancouver or London or Paris. It was a disease that basically didn't hit the center of cities. It hit the high-rise and mid-rise, low population density apartment districts, generally in the inner suburbs. In Toronto, our map showed COVID-19 almost entirely concentrated in the upper left of the city, in northern Etobicoke and North York. In Vancouver, it was concentrated almost entirely in the lower right, in Surrey for a long time. In Montreal, it was on the top of the island. And these happen to be neighborhoods that, first of all, have the highest proportion of racialized populations, which I think in this case is a proxy for immigration, because immigration since the 90s has been almost entirely a suburban phenomenon in Canada. They also were places with low income, not the lowest income. The poorest neighborhoods weren't getting hit. It was the neighborhoods that I would call aspirational poverty, people who were moving through a period of poverty into what they expected to be something better. And also they were neighborhoods of low population density, which is the thing about a suburban apartment neighborhoods in Toronto. They have few enough people per square kilometer that there was no city had ever bothered to try to put in rapid transit lines. So these populations were in so-called essential jobs, you know, working in warehouses or driving vehicles or frontline customer service or cleaning floors or what have you. And they were stuck on crowded buses back and forth to these jobs. Mostly, if you explore these neighborhoods, there are families who are seeking to move to a next level of housing or life, but it just doesn't exist. I mean, in Toronto, the ugliest little tiny house costs $1 million, and even 2-bedroom condos are getting close to $1 million. So that next step on the ladder is just missing. There's just a missing rung in Canada. Now, what could a federal government do? A federal government cannot be paying money to build lower middle class housing. There's just too much of it needed. It's not a good use of federal money. I mean, there's point to be made for lowest income housing being the priority. But what could a federal government do? It could do a shared cost program with cities to incentivize the upscaling of population density in existing residential neighborhoods. For example, by doing a shared cost 50-50 financing of low income housing buildings, but insisting as a condition for that financing that the city removes the planning approval process for a period of 5 years in X number of single family house neighborhoods to expedite the construction of higher density housing in those
So
neighborhoods.
Doug, let's take that point. Before you go on to another one, let's take that point. I want to, you can see once you can take the print journalist and put her on a video call, but the print journalist doesn't leave. So Francis is on the chat here, having lots of engagement with people on the notion of NIMBYism and all these things. Let's talk about housing. Do you collectively agree that housing should be and is the key focus? Should that be? And then what do you do about the fact that what you just described, Doug, introducing more densification and more housing into neighborhoods, there will be, as you know, tremendous pushback from folks saying, oh no, thanks very much. So I don't think it's just a question of money, is it? Is housing,
Well-
is housing where we should go first? Is that what you want to see?
Well,
Any of you, throw in. Amarjeet.
I agree with Doug on most of the points that he has made on that market housing, or getting into that market housing from low income and social housing. How do people transition into that? And there is a gap in availability. I think that gap is more prevalent in cities like Vancouver and Toronto, not as prevalent in cities like Edmonton, right? So I think market housing availability at an entry level is reasonably there, as well as city has taken some initiatives in providing incentives for first-time home buyers by
Amarjeet,
building.
can we separate though? I feel like there are two parallel conversations. One is housing the path to is housing ownership the path to the middle class and to wealth building? And is that the big bet Canada wants to stay with first? And then secondly, do we actually have the right mechanisms in place to create shelter of various forms so that people can be well housed? I feel like it's two sides of the same coin. I'm wondering, Francis, can I get you to speak as well as type about the experience in Vancouver? Because you have had a housing and a vacancy shortage for years.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, the incentives for home ownership is what Canada has focused on for almost 100 years.
Should we shift that? Should we drop
I've read books on the fight to get lower cost housing in Vancouver, and back in the 30s and 40s, the federal government was not willing to really put money into rental or social housing. They really felt that ownership was the way to go, and you still see a huge emphasis on that.
Would you change it? Do you think we should shift it?
Well, I haven't thought deeply about that, so I'm not going to start making federal policy on the fly here.
Sure.
On the off chance anyone takes me up on it and runs with my ideas, which will never happen. But I mean, clearly the problem is there needs to be so much more for all of the other forms of housing, for rental, whether it's private market or subsidized. I mean, typically in large cities, 50% of people are renters, and you wouldn't actually maybe want to change that too much, because you want those mobile populations. Cities are arrival places, as Doug has documented, where you don't necessarily want people to lock down to buying a house in their first few years here. So there just has to be a lot more options available in cities for all the other forms. And the thing I run into constantly in Vancouver when I have to go to awful public open houses and public hearings back when we used to, but a lot of people who are homeowners don't actually recognize the need for rental in the city. I've had people oppose rental saying, well, I know people need to rent. Like, I was a renter when I was a student, but this is a single family area, and, it's not a renter's area. And they don't get that the way cities are working now, that there are people, double income professional households, who are looking at renting for their
Yep.
entire lives because
And
that's
in
that's
cities
private.
around, and in great cities around the world, London and Tokyo, you don't own,
Yeah.
you rent. Go ahead, Amarjeet, and then Colin.
I was going to shift from housing to another point, Mary, which is that we are seeing racialization of certain jobs in our country, right? When you look at,
Mhm.
and that is part of the problem. And we need to tackle that issue in order to have sustainable long-term solutions. Like, who are the people who are working at the front lines of cleaning your buildings,
Mhm.
driving your taxis, driving your Uber, and who are the people who are doing the front clerk jobs at the grocery stores, right? Who are the people who are working in meat packing plants, right? And I think we have racialized low-paying jobs in a way that people are stuck in those jobs.
And
That's
they
why
don't,
you
and
have.
yeah, and unlike a potentially historic pattern of newcomers coming in, they take those jobs and then they move up. You're saying that hasn't been happening, whatever up means,
It
that
has
hasn't been
not been.
happening.
And like, look at the spread of COVID in long-term care facilities, at least in my province here in Alberta. Those people were working in more than one facilities at the same time because they couldn't make ends meet, having
Because they were underpaid, right?
underpaid and not being valued and not having enough benefits. I think we need to look at that structural challenge as well, along with housing.
Yeah. Okay, Colin, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm going to pick up on both of those points. So Amarjeet has very astutely pointed out who's working in call it low wage jobs. Now let's look at who's working in high wage jobs. Who has equity ownership of companies? Who is getting stock options? Who is founding companies, and who's getting supported by venture capitalists?
Yeah.
Who's getting funded up at massive valuations?
Yeah.
Right. We don't see a lot of racialized individuals in those roles. Right. And so, just to the point on this is not a newcomer story. It's a connectivity story. It's a who do you know that's in your network that you're going to go to, regardless of whether they're the best, have the most merit, have the greatest ideas. It's people that you trust in your network in those fields, right? And so I
Colin,
think
how do we
gotta address
disrupt that? How do we disrupt that? Because as you say, I mean, we in the early days of COVID set up some sharing platforms, including one called City Share Canada, because we wanted to show how local networks were going to start to form up to do sort of community problem solving. And it seems to me that in the old days, a neighborhood, there were civic institutions where you would meet people that were outside of your social circle. You would, what do we do now? What's the intervention now to create those connections that are missing?
Super tough question, but this is where this is where I go. It has to be multiple fold. It does start, from my perspective, in a city like Toronto, in the concept of place. And when you get neighborhoods that are, hey, it's only for the rich people and only the poor people live here, you begin to get that, call it balkanization of a city that happens. That creates some of those sort of dynamics to begin with. I mean, I think there's a lot more on education, on exposure, on incentivizing it. I hesitate saying that because I'm not sure it's necessarily the government's role, but incentivizing organizations, corporations, venture capitalists, and there on the venture capitalists, I think there's a role for government, because even in this budget, there's announcements for venture capital funding in this country, and there is a big problem in that world.
And what about if I go to the neighborhood scale, and Francis has been lamenting the fact that there's this NIMBY thing that exists, and Amarjeet was agreeing. Doug just made a particular proposal for a cost sharing to densify neighborhoods. Do you think if we could we use housing as the tool to introduce more diversities of every kind into neighborhoods and potentially along main streets, maybe?
Yes.
Is that a tangible intervention that we could make? And Doug, I'm interested for Doug to continue with the thought, and Colin, you respond, and then let's see what Doug thinks.
Yeah, I think that's in the art of the possible for sure. I mean, if you look at I was in my role at TCHC, but also in other hats, I've had a fairly good line of sight to city planning and how that works. And cities are incredibly intentional as it is right now on what gets developed, where it gets developed, how it serves the community, the mix, et cetera, right? So there's a lot of those tools in place from what I can tell. We just now got to start using those tools. And as it relates to just on the housing piece, there's a few points. One is there is a supply shortage. And I fully agree with that. And that's not just a Toronto, Vancouver story. You see it in cities around the world. I hesitate saying that point because it's made by a lot of people in the real estate world, and they have an incentive to make that point, right? They want to build buildings and make money. I think, however, the solution needs to be very intentional on what type of housing is constructed. And when you look at the rent situation, at least in Toronto, the vast majority of new rental units are contributed by condo owners.
Yep.
Right. That have bought condos for pure speculative purposes, right? They've bought them to make money, hoping for capital appreciation. And they're going to try to drive up the rent as much as possible because they're investment condos, right? We haven't actually seen a ton of purpose-built rental built, right? And so, and for various reasons. So all I'm saying here is, there's stuff being built right now. We've got a process, at least in the city of Toronto, for which I can talk to. We just have to use these tools a little bit more intentionally to create outcomes that reduce balkanization in a city like Toronto.
I think the balkanization comment is just very telling. You can see in the chat, you're getting lots of response. One of the things that COI is doing is a big thing on bringing back Main Street and restoring the core. And we're trying to make the point, diverse housing choices need to be part of the option and solution in bringing your downtown back, not just high-end condos, right? And similarly, your main streets. Doug, you had a proposal, and then I went around the world about it with this gang. The idea that the federal government create a cost-sharing program to introduce different kinds of housing mix and choice in neighborhoods. Do you want to expand on that? Did you see enough of that in the budget as laid out on Monday, or do you want to see something more?
I don't think we have enough of the fine print yet to know how it'll work, and it's certainly it's not enough to really get it started. It's interesting to see a federal role in urban housing beginning. Anyway, Colin raised a really important point, I think, in identifying what we tend to call structural racism as being a process of path dependency, basically. And he was talking about it in things like the hiring process and that sort of thing. People go with what they know. Tends to be people who look like them and come from similar backgrounds. And that's an important part of the housing process as well. And that contributes to this geographical really what you could call segregation. If you ask in Toronto, why do most Black people live out on Rogers Road or up in Northern Etobicoke in North York? Even though they come from fairly variegated backgrounds, they're Caribbean and East African immigrants and some Afro-Canadians and that sort of thing with no reason. If you ask the families who live there, they'll often tell you a story that involves them arriving in the 70s or something, and they couldn't rent a house south of Eglinton because nobody would rent to them, which is sometimes outright racism. Let's not discount that. But it's also sometimes path dependency. They were renting to the Portuguese or Italian or WASP families that they knew, and they'd created a closed circuit neighborhood. And so a city that's known for tolerance managed to generate segregation and along color lines based on market forces being allowed to do what they do. Now, simply increasing population density of neighborhoods is not necessarily going to solve that, or building more social housing or so on. There are intrinsic reasons to be doing that. And I think we need to talk about mix in terms of looking at sorry to keep getting back to this, but looking at the life course of people. When people move out of the level where they're in social housing or very low income rental housing, they usually have to move to a completely different neighborhood. And they often don't want to, but it's because Canada has structured its housing so that we have different types of housing which are in different buildings and structures. So that once you move up the ladder, you literally have to move. It's worth looking at countries like Mexico or Singapore or the Netherlands, where social housing is owned by its residents. They have a mortgage and they own it. They have a stake in it. It's heavily subsidized so that it can be done on a lower working class income. Or they have a system where you can transition from social to rental to ownership in the same neighborhood, the same building, and sometimes even the same apartment. You can change its status from social housing to a rental housing to you can purchase your unit. This is really important, this sort of stuff, for the stability of families, for the stability and continuity of neighborhoods. You don't want neighborhoods to always be stepping stone neighborhoods. One of the weird perverse effects of the housing crisis is that some really transitory stepping stone rental neighborhoods have turned into more stable places because families have been stuck there. And rather than staying for 5 years, they're staying for 15 years until they can get enough money to buy a house. But you don't really want to create stability that way by people feeling like they're stuck, and they're still going to move eventually. So I think it's worth Canadians and Canadian policymakers starting to break down this idea that there are different types of housing for different sorts of people, and that you have the poor, and then you have the middle class, and so on, and recognizing that they're often the same people in different stages of life, and that they would ideally like to be in the same neighborhood.
You know, cities, I think in the abstract, we imagine them being hives of connectivity and mobility and porousness, and you can move more freely, and all the ways in which we know as an organic system they would function healthily. And each of you is identifying a particular disconnect or ways in which that has been breaking down. Going, just if we can take us back for the last few minutes we've got together, in terms of the federal intervention, which it seems to be principally through money. You've talked about housing. You've raised the issue of immigration, which was hardly breathed in the budget, to my knowledge. We've had a year, this would be the first year in how many folks that we haven't had an influx of newcomers, significantly down. Are there, I don't know, Doug's maybe telling me I'm wrong on that. Are there any other kinds of interventions? Go ahead, Doug, do you want to respond?
Canada is welcoming 401,000 new Canadians this year, the highest level it's ever done since the mid-60s, but they all are people who are already living in Canada on non-permanent bases. It's
okay.
The pandemic has caused Canada to correct an injustice in doing so. So you're right, but it's more complicated.
In terms of other kinds of priorities, go ahead. Francis, did you want to jump back in, and then Amarjeet can come back in? Francis?
Just when you keep have brought up a couple times about, is it just about money? I mean, money is being used to change certain things. Like I was writing in the chat about American states are increasingly moving to this thing of taking control, or demanding certain things from cities that before they had said, oh, you do whatever you want, local control is the best. They're now saying, you know, many cities are moving to a system where they're requiring cities to meet housing targets. They can choose which way they want to do it, but they have to accommodate newcomers in some way. They're not allowing cities to ban certain types of housing, like, you know, laneway houses or triplexes or whatever. And I keep hearing that this is we're going to see more of this in Canada. And there's been a lot of discussion, and Amarjeet probably knows about this, you know, say tying transit dollars to municipalities' willingness to provide new housing. And that has happened in some states. If they're not willing to provide the housing, the transit dollars don't go there.
So in this way, would you be advocating for that, based on what you're hearing, is that maybe that's the way to get around NIMBYism and local resistance, is you set some...
Well, you know, that is what federal and state governments are doing, and starting to talk about this in Canada more. It becomes not just money. Money is the lever to produce other kinds of changes. And I can see Amarjeet getting excited here.
Yeah, I think Francis, what you're touching on is really it's about affordability, right? How do you make your living affordable in urban centers? And affordability is not only tied to housing; it's tied to access to public transit. It ties to access to recreational facilities, to libraries, to parks, and other amenities that people living in urban centers need. So that integration of transportation and land use planning and where the amenities are is a big piece of puzzle that needs to be resolved in order to make sure that living is affordable.
Amarjeet, where would the leadership come from on that?
I think leadership comes from municipalities on that. I think what federal government has to do is provide tools, and particularly mainly funding tools, right? And I think you don't want to have federal government dictating to municipalities to how to design their neighborhoods, right? I think that'll be a wrong approach. I think there's enough leadership at municipal levels to tackle those issues as long as you give them the proper tools. And the final point I want to make, which is ties to our earlier conversation, is that housing as a human right, absolutely, I believe in that. But we will not be able to deal with issues of social issues until we have a more of a systemic approach to housing, to mental health, to addiction, to poverty, to racism and marginalization, and you add many other things. I think what we need is more of a how do we see intersectionality of all these things together, and how do we find solutions that are not siloed, but more of integrated solutions.
It's interesting, we had the occasion of the federal budget to pull you together. It's an old trope in Canada. We wait to see, what the Crown is going to say, and then we respond. Is there, Colin, is there a way to build this from the ground up? What Amarjeet just made a big call there for a kind of new urban agenda, I think I heard, just saying. Colin, what do you think? We're in the round here where each of you really can just give us one last thought about reflecting on the federal engagement in cities. So over to you first, Colin.
Yeah, I think there's aperture, there's opportunity to do this more from a ground up perspective, and it should be done from a more ground up perspective. I think that's what we've seen in the last year and a half and more, that it should be. I do think government plays just on the money piece. Government doesn't just give money, government convenes. Government should convene. That's what and all three levels of government should convene. But one of the things on the Black Opportunity Fund, the reason why we've structured it in the way we have is on the belief that we should convene government with courts, with philanthropy, with foundations, with individuals to help us address something systemic in society. Right now, we saw government take first steps on that 2 days ago with the budget. Not enough, in my opinion, but they took first steps. But I think as I went through the budget, there's different areas where they're hinting at that. But I think we got to call it a quantum leap forward and look at, the government, the budget, just not as a dollar figure, as an opportunity to bring multiple actors together to actually try to deal with stuff. There's plenty of other things like the opioid epidemic, mental health. Those are going to be massive issues. My partner treats folks with addictions. I get to see this all day, and it's especially acute in this pandemic. And I think when we come out of this, hopefully soon, we will be dealing with something very significant there in cities as well.
So there's government as leader, and maybe, Francis, 30 seconds to you, government as setting a standard to which the other level government has to live up to. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, what everyone says, if states or federal governments are going to intervene in how cities work, they set a goal, but they let each city figure out how they're going to get to that goal. So it's not a question of coming in and rezoning every lot,
right.
And things like that. It's left up to the cities to figure out how they get to that goal, and states and provinces and federal governments have an interest in that, because one of the things that we've ignored here, we've talked a lot about equity, which is important, but cities are the economic engines. And if they start failing because they can't house people, that is a problem for everybody.
And if they start failing because they don't have enough workers, or the workers are being so poorly paid that they have all sorts of other disadvantages and a cost to the system. 30 seconds to you, Doug, at federal engagement in cities. Any further thoughts from you? And then to you, Amarjeet, to take us home. Go ahead, Doug.
Well, I think my colleagues here have provided a set of options that work really well. I'm going to be optimistic and say this is a foot in the door. This is the beginning of an understanding that the federal government can bypass provinces that are difficult and can help end cities' imprisonment under provincial governments by engaging in shared cost programs. It doesn't have to be big spending programs. It can be incentives and leverage and assistance in other ways.
Okay, last word to you, Amarjeet.
Well, we need to have tons of more conversations like this.
Yeah, we do.
Right. And in order to really figure out the solutions to these very complex problems, right? And I think I am optimistic. I think we will come out of COVID more stronger in a way, because there's a more realization that the issues that we have ignored for decades cannot be ignored no longer, right? So, and we need to tackle them. I think that realization is happening at the federal level. It is happening absolutely at the municipal levels. And I hope there'll be more realization at provincial levels as well. I think that sense of collaboration that we saw at the onset of COVID, we need that kind of collaboration coming out of COVID and tackling these big issues.
Just an extraordinary wake-up call, I think, for all of us that care about the places that we live in, all the different circumstances that are coalescing to make us realize what we have to still fix and what we have to change. And with that comes an opportunity, right, to do some changing. So thank you so much, Colin and Amarjeet and Doug and Francis. I agree with Amarjeet. We need more of these conversations. Honestly, I could spend several hours with you four, appreciating all the different perspectives. Thanks for all the engagement in the chat. Those of you that are missing City Talk in terms of our regular meter, just be aware we are helping administer the Canada Healthy Communities Initiative, and that is placemaking, tangible, on the ground in neighborhoods, being led by community groups and municipalities and different kinds of organizations across the country to actually make a difference in their community by doing various kinds of interventions. And we hope there'll be more and more of that. We hope you'll join us for some mobilization sessions. We have one on the 4th of May, and then we have another one on the 12th, where we're going to talk about how other cities are finding tangible ways to improve neighborhoods that we hope catalyze this kind of thing. I want to do something on housing with you guys, so I'm not losing your phone numbers, and all the different imaginative ways that you're proposing a kind of revolution with evolution without a revolution, is I think what I heard Francis hinting on, and Amarjeet's in the thick of it. So Doug, always appreciate your perspectives. Colin, great to have you. Thanks everybody for joining us on City Talk. Hope you enjoy the magnolias and the snow, and that we just stay in it together as we try to fend our way through the third wave. Thanks everybody.
Bye everyone.